Thank you, and good morning. It's a lovely sunny day here. I'll just crack open my window. You can hear the birds are singing. It's glorious sunshine. I'm sitting here with my scrumptious, steamy, very powerful cup of coffee. Out of the window, I'm trying to paint a picture for you here. I can see the church. I can see our local school playground. There's no children out there, luckily, screaming, although sometimes I can hear that. And it's one of those days where you just feel lucky to be alive. As I touch my croissant that I had this morning, it's all yellow and gooey butter. Oh, it's just fantastic. I mean, what a great day. But I'm digressing slightly. I'm conscious that people have attended this to hear about sensory inspiration, or to give this presentation its more complete title. The more complete title is Using Leading-Edge Qualitative Thinking to Inspire, Rejuvenate, and Reinvent the Sensory Product Development Process. And I am questioning whether I currently have control, because I am unable to navigate up and down on my slides. Okay, I've come down. That's great. I've got control. So let's continue. So after my brief digression, sensory inspiration, using leading-edge qualitative thinking to inspire, rejuvenate, and reinvent the sensory product development process. So my name is Dan Foreman. I'm from Insight International. We're a full-service market research agency originating in Asia, and we are now expanding throughout the rest of the world, and in particular in Europe, hence why I'm speaking in this time zone. This is largely an audio-visual experience. Of course, I'm sitting here looking out the window with the birds, and the rest of you will be listening from your desks or your hotel rooms, wherever around the world. So when we try and talk about the senses, it's difficult because, of course, we all have at least 5 senses, maybe more, depending on your school of thought. So I will do what I can using the power and the means of audio and video to try and give some sensory inspiration. But of course, we're only using at least 40% of our capabilities. On to really the focus of the presentation. There's going to be 3 main messages that are coming through from this. The first one is very simple. I will hopefully illustrate that the sensory research world, the world in which I operate and the focus of this presentation, is too reliant, over-reliant on lab-based research. The real world, the world where I'm listening to the birds and drinking my coffee and you're sitting at your desks, that is not a laboratory. And the real-world environment does not really capture perhaps some of the surprises and things which just happen in the real world. For example, you can probably hear now, very annoying, I'm listening to the birds, I'm trying to do a presentation, and my neighbour has just started his car. Luckily, he's a petrol head, he'll go away shortly, and we won't really hear that, so please bear with me, it's very noisy, it should go, it's ruining my peace. So, right, okay, he's going, I can see him now, he's disappearing out the window. So now he's gone, there's been many interesting, he's gone now, that's good. There have been many interesting advances in the market research world in recent times, and there will continue to be more. Only last week at the Market Research Society conference, people were talking about lots of new things, and those of us who have been part of the NewMR generation have, for the last couple of years, been hearing about amazing new things which we can do in market research. And, of course, there's new things that we haven't heard about and new things being developed as we speak and interact now. So the third point is that let's add these 2 things together, and within the sensory world, it's very obvious, but it will create all sorts of opportunities for us, many interesting things for us to explore and things to learn. So what I will hopefully illustrate today is just some of those things, and perhaps even pique your curiosity for some other ways that you can go off and explore, not just in sensory research, but perhaps also in qualitative. So my kind of last point, the one for luck, the bonus, if you like, is that as qualitative researchers, perhaps we can all learn something too. So you know, listen carefully. That there will be opportunities throughout all of this for us to take sidebars and to perhaps capture a tangential thought, just something where you can think, maybe I could use that music, maybe I could use that stimulus, maybe I could introduce a group a little bit differently, maybe I could get a bit more co-creation in some of my exercises. I think here in this environment we have the opportunity just to step back slightly and to ask ourselves, what could we do a little bit differently as qualitative researchers to put the heart of qual back into qualitative research. And some of what I share today should hopefully give us a little bit of that inspiration. So I have hung this presentation around the concept of sensory research and sensory inspiration. So I'll just give you a few moments of background on sensory research and the sensory research world before we start to talk about how it shouldn't be so laboratory based, and there are lots of interesting things that we can do, and applying them opens up many opportunities for us. So the flavors and fragrances world, if we focus on that, is massive. It is a huge market there, and it's just destined to keep growing. All the predictions suggest that this is a market that's still embryonic. It is huge. It is $20 billion. Yet, if you walk down a supermarket today, you will see that there's all sorts of, choose any category, and within any category, whether it's detergents, shampoos, food, drink, you will be able to walk down that aisle in a supermarket and see an amazing range of sounds as you open products or as things get squished out of bottles. There's a sensory experience to do with what you hear. There's also amazing colors, textures, tastes, smells. All of these different things are a rich part of the product development process, and even the packaging development process too. The sound of a champagne cork, perhaps the unsealing, even in pharmaceuticals, of some child safety pills. All of these things are part of the sensory experience, which forms part of our brand experience and our interaction with the product. So $20 billion just on flavors and fragrances. I'm sure you've all seen this iconic hotel in Dubai. The most expensive room there, you could hire for 3,500 years for $20 billion. You could buy 200 of these yachts. There's a lot of things you can do with this. Or, if we ground this in the market research world, WPP Insight Division, $20 billion is equivalent to 100 of those, so 100 years worth of WPP profit from the Insight Division is the same. It's just this small sensory flavors and fragrances category, which actually affects lots of the things we do on a daily basis, the things we consume. This has made big news in recent months in the UK industry, the UK advertising industry. Some clever people have made poster adverts at bus stops, made them smell of jacket potatoes, so McCain, oven-baked tastiness in 5 minutes. You press a button, and I know the potato here perhaps also looks like somebody's bottom. So there's a different sensory experience there, or perhaps a different tangential thought that you can write down. But you touch the button, and out pops this amazing aroma of a jacket potato with lovely creamy butter. But these guys aren't as clever as they perhaps think they are. In 1960, there was a film called The Scent of Mystery, using an amazing new technology called smell-o-vision. Oh, what a name, smell-o-vision. What happened here is that during the film, 30 different scents were injected from near the speakers into the auditorium, so that during the movie, as these people were exploring their mystery and traveling throughout Spain, you also got perhaps a different sort of 3D experience where the smell was coming into the theatre. Now, I've tried this at home. I've got the DVD, but of course a huge part of this experience is the smell. You know, I have my children opening chocolate, splashing around with frying pans or spraying air fresheners, but it's not the same. So here, even in 1960, the cinema world understood the power of just one of these single sensors by injecting these scents during the process of a movie. So there's a little bit of context on just how big and how involved the various sensors are in our everyday world. First thing to remember, the sensory research world is too reliant on lab-based research. The real world is not a laboratory. According to 3 famous sensory scientists, they describe the sensory research process as treating the entire process as a clinical exercise to eliminate that intractable humanness that makes the results a bit sloppy in favor of reporting clean, statistically supportable results. And that's sensory scientists saying that. So does this make the results more relevant? Does it miss opportunities? Does it waste some of the chances we have of exploring by eliminating this humanness? This very thing we often desire in qualitative research is being eliminated in the sensory research process. Is this the right way? Really, is this how we should be? Is this how sensory research and sensory science should be conducted? Of course, there's a time and a place for this kind of work, but here's a typical sensory environment, a sensorium. For those who haven't been in the sensory research world, this is how it looks. Does that look like market research? Does it look like hard science? What should it look like? This certainly is not the real world, yet this is where flavors and fragrances and amazing products are created. Here's a whole range of images from our own credentials, and we explore the boundaries of sensory science and sensory research, but look, this is what we're doing every day. And you go into these environments, it's an amazing research environment, but as a market researcher, you look at this, it's scary to the point that maybe even the hairs on the back of your neck will stand up. And there's an emotional response. Do I look at this and feel this is a qualitative environment? Maybe not. There's a room for qualitative, but that means moving outside of this sterile environment. I'm now going to show you an example output. This is a real extract from a real piece of research for a real client. What would the data visualization experts do with this? Do you even understand it? Like reading data tables, a trained expert will see all sorts of things very quickly, but we're not all trained experts. We're not all sensory scientists, yet we are all great researchers who contribute to the product development and brand development processes. And can we quickly see what's going on here? Is this an exciting output, or is it a confusing or a scary output? I don't know. It depends who you are and where you're sitting as to what you see from this. Here's an example lexicon. So lexicons are the agreed language that an expert panel would use to describe certain products. And this is, again, a real extract from a lotions report. So here you see we have reference standards, intensity value, and people score them according to numbers and occasionally ISO references. Is this the language of the consumer? Or do we speak perhaps a little bit differently when we talk about lotions? Do we say, oh, it sticks to my arm, it took a while to rub in, I don't like the smell of it, what's that colour? We don't talk like this, do we? We don't talk the language of sensory science. Or do we? Do we really talk like sensory scientists? Do we use these sensors in everyday language? Only 2 weeks ago, I heard one of the Welsh rugby players talking before they won the Grand Slam about how he could sniff success. And we have all these other expressions throughout the language. A taste of victory, a sight for sore eyes. And if I didn't have these incessant birds going on in the background, the sound of silence. And then we also use adjectives to describe in different ways all sorts of amazing things that happen in our world. We describe somebody as being the salt of the earth, or somebody as having sour grapes. We even talk about the volume of a shirt. only last week in the New York Times there was an article about synesthesia, and it was an article about neuroscience, about how when people use more descriptive words like sweet nothing or bitter wind, it actually stimulates, in the person listening, it stimulates an entirely different area of the brain. So it accesses other areas in the information processing part of your brain, which is interesting for neuroscientists, which suggests that the more colourful the language you can use, or the more cross-sensory language you use when describing things, the greater brain activity is generated in the mind of the receiver. Now, that has massive implications for not only me trying to communicate to you now, but also how we communicate in qualitative research, what kind of questions we would use or statements we would put forward, visually and auditory, and how we describe things in a group environment, but also in delivering presentations. So already I can see that there's all sorts of different applications just from this New York Times article. So hopefully I've established there, briefly, that the sensory research world has got something to learn from the real world, because the real world is not the laboratory that we use. So how do we do that? Well, NewMR is all about making the most of these interesting advances in the market research world. The first NewMR festival that I took part in was in 2010, and there's been many events since, and many of you will have attended all sorts of different events, and hopefully through that you've been exposed to different elements of the research process, borrowing best practice from other industries, other sectors, and you can see there's lots to learn. I'll touch briefly, just on a couple of pages, of things that our organization has tried within the sensory research process. So this is, again, just focusing on sensory research, this small $20 billion flavors and fragrance area. We've looked at some of the things which have been featured in NewMR and in other conference platforms. We've explored creating the bot style of data collectors that operate in a free form. We've tried putting a return on investment for sensory research. We look at optimization driven by interpretation or driven by respondents themselves or expert panelists. We've fused data from all sorts of different environments, and this presentation is available to look at after, so I won't go through all of these different pieces. But you see here there's 2.5 pages worth of bullets of things that we've learned that are traditionally falling under the scope of NewMR, or interesting things which are happening in market research that we can apply just simply to this laboratory-based world. So now the fun bit, or the thing that I think is fun. What happens when we start combining these two? Well, all sorts of things happen. Very exciting, very inspiring, does lead to all sorts of other interesting discussions and explorations and new hypotheses and initiatives with a client and without the client too, things that we take away ourselves for further learning. So I'm just going to share with you 4 examples, and there are many, and of course we'd be happy to carry on talking about them in the Q&A or another time. So there are many different examples that we can talk about here, but I'm selecting just these 4. So the first one that I'm going to talk to you about is some learning that we've had in the water landscape, and specifically the water landscape in India. So I'm sure that many of you will know that in India the water quality, the natural water quality, differs significantly across all sorts of different locations, much more so than we would experience over here. That has massive impact for when people are washing their clothes, or indeed washing their food, but here we're focusing on clothes. Significantly, it impacts the amount of lather or lather that a detergent produces. Simply, the harder the water, the less the lather. So what we did is we used a qualitative research to ask various people throughout the communities who are involved in the washing process. So typically that's mothers and children, to do the equivalent of market mapping, but with an objective of forming a brief, a language brief for R&D, which would be taken forward into product formulations. So we used the qualitative process to build the equivalent of a glossary lexicon so that we could compare the ISO numbers, the kind of language you saw earlier, with real language. So people talk about foamy, frothy, sticky, etc. Well, what does that mean for an R&D scientist? And how were we able to map that out? And here, this is a single slide, so there's just two simple images, but this also involved other NewMR activities like using smartphones to take photos of what foamy really meant and what foamy meant in different contexts for different types of clothes, different washing methods. We were able to build that, which then gave a much more tailored R&D brief when it goes through to product development, product formulation. So there are a few different applications of NewMR style development within a qualitative environment, but putting qualitative at the heart of sensory research development, because of course then the R&D process takes place a long way away from these rivers and waters in India. A second example here, I'm focusing on showering, but it equally applies across a number of other areas, including cooking. This is very simple. We're using mobile technology, apps in particular, an app we have. It's a very simple brief. You ask somebody to click the record button, the start button, when they go into the shower. There's no video recording here. And then you click at the end. Now, for some scientists, this is hugely valuable information. This tells you exactly how long somebody spent showering, or exactly how long somebody spent between hitting the start button and the finish button, which gives, in our collective belief, a much stronger read on accuracy for how long somebody spends in the shower, or how long somebody spends cooking something, or all sorts of other areas. It also gives you an accurate read of time of day. It allows follow-up questions to be more targeted, and of course it applies into all sorts of other areas too. Now, playing that forward, there's some other experiments we're doing where we are downloading apps passively, and so we're recording all sorts of things based on geography and time in different locations with respondents' permission, which allows for things like journey planning and all sorts of other applications which at this point we have to keep secret, but all sorts of other applications around the communications development process. Simple things to do with what you're hearing and seeing as you're navigating your daily life and going through things there. Then, of course, body language. Much has been made, and we've seen some excellent papers put around on face scanning and face recognition and mapping emotions from people's expressions in all sorts of conferences in many places. One of the fundamental principles of an expert panel in sensory research is to be accurate with your descriptions. So to talk about extensive bitterness or extensive oiliness, to the point where you saw the lexicon earlier, there were scales out of 10 to a first decimal place on how oily something could be. What this completely ignores in this process is any kind of preference or any kind of emotional response. This is very objective, hardcore sensory science. So the question was posed by us and taken on, luckily, by a few different clients, for us to continue to do what we do, where we're looking at strengths of bitterness or oiliness and all these other attributes, but to apply an implied preference or emotional response by using face scanning. And the results are fascinating. Just because somebody can tell you that a chocolate has a bitterness score of 4.3, that tells you nothing about whether they like it or not. And historically, you would go away and do all sorts of consumer preference data, maybe do some preference mapping, and you get an understanding of what works best in the real world. But it has been fascinating to learn with an expert panel who is trained to be purely objective, to get their emotional read on what they like or don't like. because this has historically not been part of the role of sensory science. So some fascinating learnings there and something to consider. And then I touched upon synesthesia earlier. Cross-sensory metaphors, we've done some work here around fragrances, where simply you ask somebody to sniff something, to smell a different fragrance, and you ask them initially to describe or write down or explore what that evoked in their own mind. And given the right environment, given the right encouragement and motivation, we can have we receive incredibly powerful materials from this, which not only useful for R&D, but also carries all the way through into communication briefs. Hence the volcano description picture here. You're opening something. You see an explosion of different thoughts and ideas coming through. And here, I should reference that throughout the presentation so far, there's been a number of different images, some of which, if you have been doing one of the things I suggested at the start, to occasionally write down something where you have a tangential thought sparked off, then some of these pictures should have illustrated or sparked you to think in a different way. Only a few more slides to go. It's really important when we think about the senses in qualitative research, really to think about the impact that any sensory description or sensory experience can have. And you will have seen on the links to the presentation that there's a video uploaded of Ratatouille. And if you watch that video, you will know that the chap in the video, he eats a bit of ratatouille which he expects to be disgusting, but actually it transforms him into all these amazing memories of childhood. And a simple tomato-based product makes him feel incredibly nostalgic and satisfied and grateful to be alive. So I also really wanted to show you another video, but we have some technical challenges showing video. So please watch the other video, the Louis Armstrong one, and use your senses. The video that I chose is a particularly powerful one because the words of Louis Armstrong are very sensory themselves, and it can push you in all sorts of different directions if you use your imagination and you look at the images. So trees of green and red roses blue, etc. Have a look at those things and please ask yourself the simple question, what would Louis Armstrong do if he was moderating my next focus group? And it's a fun exercise. These things are occasionally good to do. Of course, you'll get some good ideas coming from that. So please watch that video and ask yourself some of those questions. The final thing I just wanted to show is an extract from the SimRise, one of the businesses we work with. Just an extract from their annual report, and there's a lot of detail here, and if you're interested you can download the annual report from their website. But the expert view here is that fragrances and flavors and the sensory experience are becoming increasingly individualized, and in particular there are huge learnings from other markets outside of the UK where I'm sitting and Europe. And I was speaking earlier today with somebody who was very jealous that they've just come back from a holiday in Australia and Singapore, and they're now back in the UK, and they're just getting a completely different sensory experience. The bird noises are different, the flower colours are different, the smells, everything is different for them. Of course, that was an incredibly enriching holiday for them, and they learned lots. But it's important for us to look to these other markets for areas of influence in sensory science, but of course in qualitative research too, and not just in a sensory perspective, but what kind of best practice is happening in these different environments. It's a good opportunity for us to sit back and reflect and to consider what are the trends in Southeast Asia, for example, and how can I apply that in my qualitative process. So the summary of the things I said at the start, the 3 things to remember, maybe the 4th one, but the sensory research world is now embracing some of the opportunities that have come out from the Advances in Market Research with very interesting, inspiring results. And please go off and explore some yourself, or ask me or others for their learnings too. And please don't lose sight of the fact that there's learnings beyond sensory science. There's learnings for qualitative too. So here I'll finish. Hopefully this will have been a useful and interesting presentation for you. And now back over to Sue.